throughout the meeting. But so one thing I want to point out, you can add chat into the box, and we all try to keep a look at the box when it's coming in to see if there's questions. There is also a section on Zoom, so you can, down at the bottom of your screen, I should say, there's a chat box. You can send questions in. We will try to go over that. This session is being recorded, and we'll share notes after the call. So there's that. All right. Today's is going to be a focus on food safety and wildlife. And if Donna's on, I really would like Donna to introduce Paula, because Donna is the person who suggested Paula for this talk. So I'd love for Donna to say a few words about Paula. That's putting Donna on the spot. Surprise.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Betsy. I will take a couple of minutes and introduce Dr. Paula Rivadeneira. She is an assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Arizona, and I believe Paula is located directly at the Yuma Agricultural Center. And I met Paula a couple of years ago. I believe she was still a postdoc under Dr. Michelle J. Russell at UC Davis. And I believe I met her just when she was starting her research and her work at University of Arizona. I have a little bit of introduction for this. I co-trained with Paula last year at an integrated training, and she presented Module 4, and I thought she just did a fabulous job. When I asked her she would be interested in presenting, I just found a lot of her anecdotes and research stories very filling. And I always struggle a little bit with Module 4 and kind of filling out the flexibility in the rule and giving practical examples of wildlife management, and I thought Paula could kind of walk us through parts of Module 4 and kind of explain that for us.
Great, thank you, Donna. I appreciate that. After she's done, we'll do a little bit of a PSA update, but with no further ado, Paula, welcome to the PSA Educators Call.
And Paula, you should have control now if this all works according to plan.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Donna, for the introduction and for recommending me. I'm really excited about this because I am a wildlife biologist, and so I came into food safety after being a wildlife biologist, so it's really awesome to be able to do this module. I'm really excited about it. So what I did for you today is I took Module 4, and I added in some additional slides with pictures and things like that so that we can talk about where you can add in different kinds of stories and research and things like that. So I have the whole module here, but we're not going to do every single slide. I'm just going to go to directly the ones that I have updated for you with different pictures. So I have a little bit of lag, I think, in when I hit it. Oops. Don, it says I'm controlling, but it won't let me, and I see your cursor.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. So let's do that same thing. I'm going to take it back from you, or can you give it back to me, please?
Yes.
There we go. Stop remote, and we'll do it again. If I can, while we're there, you go. So it looks like you're on. Before we started, one of the things that because Paula has made modifications to the PowerPoint, we've taken some pains to make sure that it's clear what's part of the standardized curriculum and what are the added slides. One of the things that does get a little bit maybe confusing is the provision symbol in the bottom right corner. Sometimes because Paula is going to give us bullet point by bullet point, sometimes every bullet point that has a provision symbol on the slide isn't actually a requirement of the rule. So just bear with us on that, please. Back to you, Paula.
Okay. Let's see if I can move forward here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to skip the learning objectives. You guys all know what those are, and jump right in. So right away, we're going to start talking about pathogens that the animals can carry. Uh-oh, I see your cursor again.
Well, what I did was I got off to unmute me, and then
oh.
So there we go. You should be back on again.
Yep, there we are. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about poop today, of course, because that's how the pathogens are spread, usually through deposition of feces. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how difficult wildlife can be to control. And so you think about the birds and the small animals that you may not see coming and going, but really, how are you going to keep a bird out of your field? That's one of the biggest issues that farmers have. It's one of the biggest issues that they talk to me about all the time, is how do we keep these birds from getting in? Because you certainly can't use a fence for that. So we will talk about some bird deterrents later on in the talk, but I want to talk about fencing and these critters in particular. So depending on where you are in the country, you may have javelina, like the guy on top, or you may have wild pigs, and I know those guys look very similar, but they're not. Javelina are peccaries, which is a whole different critter than the wild pigs, but both of them are very, very strong animals. And unless you're going to put up some sort of brick wall, it's going to be really hard to keep these guys out. And with the deer, a lot of times we put up fences. We know that deer can jump 6 feet, and you go, okay, I'll put up a 6-foot fence. And then you don't realize there's a little dip somewhere, and all it's going to take is those couple of inches, and that deer is going over the fence. And so growers have to be really meticulous in figuring out what kind of fence to use, how tall it needs to be, where it needs to be put. And you need to know which animals you're dealing with. That's the really important thing. You can't just do a blanket statement and say, hey, there's wildlife, and we're going to put up a fence. So it has to be really specific for the critters in your field. So wildlife are really important, obviously, right? And we find them all around our farms. They're all over the landscape. And that's why FSMA is now promoting this idea of co-management. And I love co-management because oops, did you just switch my slide? I think you did. That's okay. I'm going to see if I can go back. Oh, what is happening? Uh-oh. Can you still hear me?
I can still hear you. Just give us a second. There we go. You're back.
Okay. So there we go. I think I have it. Okay. There we go. So FSMA promotes the idea of co-management, which is the idea that you can have your farm and you can have your wildlife too. So we want to come up with ways that we can continue to manage our agriculture while not impacting the wildlife around it. So one of the things that we talk about is that you need to talk with your local game and fish and wildlife, however it's called in your state or your area, because everybody's got their own kind of rules and regulations about what you can and cannot do with wildlife. So people often think that, you know, it's okay to scare away the birds in certain ways, but you have to make sure that that really is okay. There are some times that you might need a depredation permit. There's sometimes that there are noise ordinances. And so you just have to make sure. Here in Arizona, I work a lot with Arizona Game and Fish. But when it comes to birds, you need to keep in mind that you also have to work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have some very strict rules about birds. Arizona Game and Fish has been great in working with us in terms of javelina and deer and things like that. And then we always count on Fish and Wildlife for bird issues. And with birds, this, of course, is a really interesting situation because these guys are flying over and in the field. And you think, well, how are we going to keep them out? What are you supposed to do? It's very easy to throw your hands up and go, we can't do anything about it. But you need to, because they are the most likely to get into your field without you even realizing it. So the birds, though, can be residents or they can be transient. Here in Yuma, our birds are pretty much residents. We do have a lot of migratory birds, but even birds that usually migrate in other areas, they pretty much stick around here all year round because the weather is beautiful. But one of the things that you need to think about is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that's why you have to deal with U.S. Fish and Wildlife when it comes to birds, because this act protects all common birds in the U.S. There's very few exceptions, and basically what it says that it's unlawful to kill, capture, possess, buy, sell, trade, ship, import, or export any migratory bird, and it's not just the animal. That includes feathers, parts, nests, eggs. You can't take any of that out of the field. So it's really important that you work with your local agencies and the federal agencies, because obviously if you have a situation with migratory birds in your field, you still need to get them out of there. So you have to find a legal way to be able to do that. So an interesting thing happened when I was out trapping birds one day. This is my friend and colleague, Carrington, and she worked for Arizona Game and Fish while I was working on my project. And we were out one day trapping birds. We were trying to figure out if birds were carrying pathogens from a nearby CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation, into the fields nearby. And you can see that there's lots of native habitat right around there. So we catch this bird in the mist net, and we had no idea what it was. She didn't know, I didn't know. I'd never caught one of these before. And so she starts panicking, and we are looking through, we carry all of our guidebooks with us. And so we're looking through like 4 different guidebooks to see what kind of bird this is. And she's freaking out thinking we're going to get arrested. And I thought, I said to her, Carrington, you're Arizona Game and Fish. So if you don't arrest us, we're good. And it ends up that it was not what she thought it could have been, which was a local threatened species here in Yuma. It ends up that it's a green heron. So it ended up just being a really cool bird to catch. It's the only time I've ever caught a green heron, and this was a couple years ago here in Yuma. So it was just a fun story of freaking out Arizona Game and Fish with what we caught in the mist net. So it was kind of fun. And then, of course, we're going to talk more about the types of wildlife that are on the farm and the management options that are available. And one of the things that is really important for farmers to do is to assess the risks from wildlife. And when you're assessing risks, you have to think about, are there tracks? Is there poop in the field? How often does it show up? Is it all over the place or only in one position within your field? And so I always tell people to know your poop. It's very important to know your poop. So if you're looking at a pile of poop, you need to know, did that come from a javelina, or did it come from a coyote, or is it a deer? Because that's going to help you figure out how to keep them out. So here in Arizona, we have the Southwest Arizona Track and Scat Glove Box Guide. You might see a familiar name in the authors at the bottom, not to push the book, but we actually gave this out for free to all of our growers because we wanted them to see exactly what the tracks and the scat are from each animal. And so we've listed them out in this book. And there's another one that someone had sent me just to take a look at, and I didn't include a picture of it here, but it's for I believe the Northwest, and it's called Northwoods Animal Scat. And it's not a guide book, but it's on a keychain, and it's all plastic, and it's got little rulers and pictures of poop, and it's actually a really handy little thing to keep with you. And the website, if you wanted to check that out, is www.northwoodsguides.com. And so that's a Northwoods one, and then we've got this one for Southwest Arizona. So what I'm wondering is if any of you have something similar in your regions. Do any of you have this type of track and scat book?
Well, I'm unable to unmute them without taking control away from you. But if anybody wants to put their links into the text box, we can call that out. Does that seem right?
Let's see. Can I see a box, or you guys can only see a box?
If you open up the chat box in the top of your screen, you should see an option to see chat box.
One of the respondents right now said she sent it to everybody, not specific to Arkansas.
Okay. Okay, well, so maybe there aren't a bunch of these books. It would be really handy for your farmers to have something like this. Oh, I see Chana wrote something there.
Good. And we could compile those and put those into the notes also after this. So anybody who comes up with one, please put it into the chat box and we'll compile those.
So Chana, who is another author on the Track and Scat Glove Box Guide, said that we can also distribute the Arizona Track and Scat Glove Box Guide if there's interest. Great. Thanks, Chana. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. So when you're thinking about your farmers are thinking about where they're going to plant, they have to think about if there are lots of animals visiting. Are there herds of deer? Are there flocks of migrating birds? Or anything else that might be coming through? Herds of javelina, feral pigs, things like that. And in doing so, you have to think about what the management practices are going to have to be and how that's going to affect the crops and the water and things like that. And mixed in with all of that, you have to be worried about food safety, because that's what we're always talking about, right? We have to be concerned with food safety. We know there's wildlife around. So how are we going to co-manage to make sure that our crops stay pathogen free and that our wildlife are unharmed? So we've got discussion of co-management here, and I'm going to move ahead to the next slide. Here we go. So the next slide here in red, this is actually part of the slide. I just made it in red to highlight it for you. And it says that removal of conservation practices can damage natural resources and may not mitigate the hazards posed by domesticated and wild animals. And so basically what this is telling us is that if you stop maintaining wild habitat and you take it away, you remove the wild habitat thinking, well, if we get rid of native habitat, the animals won't be here anymore. What actually ends up happening is you are going to see an increase in animals in the field, because now you've taken away their food, water, shelter, and mates. And so where are they going to go? They have to go somewhere. And a lot of times that means you're going to see increased activity in the field. So it might seem counterintuitive that if you take away habitat, there will be more activity, but there will be, because it's kind of like, you know, they become homeless, and where are they supposed to go, and where are they going to look for water? Well, they're going to go straight to the field. So that's why it's really important to maintain these conservation practices and do some level of maintaining wild habitat in a way that will keep the animals out. So for me as a wildlife biologist, I always try to think like the animal that I'm trying to keep out of there, right? And so when you're thinking like these animals, you need to do something that makes them decide they don't want to be there, right? And so if you're taking away their habitat, the thing that's keeping them outside the field, because that's where they want to live, that's a problem, right? Because then they go, well, where are we going to go? We're going to start eating your lettuce, and we're going to start drinking the water out of your sprinklers. So think like the animal that you're trying to keep out, and then implement the conservation practices that will make those animals decide that they don't want to be in the field. They want to be in some periphery somewhere, because the periphery is way better than inside the field. So this talks a little bit about that bare ground and the hedgerow vegetation, and just the idea of not having bare ground around your fields, because it ends up, they've done studies now that show that the bare ground is not going to help your situation with your wildlife. They will become more active in your fields. So during the growing season, of course, you're going to monitor for feces, and right before harvest, you're going to do lots of activities that center around looking for signs of animals. So either fecal contamination or tracks. You look for them feeding on the plants and things like that, and you have to assess your risks. But you really want to start with deterring them, right? Because if you get your deterrence right, then when you get to those assessment points, then you won't have to worry so much. Hopefully there won't be anything there. And so one of the first things that people do is they set up decoys. And while these are fun to look at, they oftentimes don't really help very much. If you have a small grower that has some of these decoys up, and they're able to move these decoys throughout the day, then they can be helpful. But the problem is when you're sitting on hundreds of acres, the decoys aren't going to work. What happens is the birds end up coming and landing on them. I've seen Canadian geese walk right up to, a coyote decoy. So you need some sort of movement in these decoys, whether they're moving on their own, like the owl here with the flappy wings, or if you're physically moving them to different locations. But wildlife are smarter than you think, especially birds. So they're going to catch on to you. And that crazy scarecrow thing on the right, so that's what we use here in Yuma. I've seen a lot of these scarecrows that are up, and they've got the mylar hands and the mylar head and things like that. I've seen birds land on them when it's not windy out. So we do it because, in a way, the growers have to check a box that says we are doing everything that we can do to keep these animals away. So none of the things that we're going to talk about work on their own. So there's always going to have to be multiple aspects. And so one of the things that they do are they use these crazy scarecrows. But we will use other things in addition to that. So another one, of course, is fencing and netting. And these are really difficult to manage because of the amount of space that you have to put up fences for. So here in Yuma, because we have mostly large commercial growers, they have to put up miles and miles of fencing. It's very, very expensive. And so they need to make sure they're getting it right. So for example, we talked about the deer fencing, minimum 6 feet. But then you have to look around and see, are there any dips in the ground? Are there any little hills that they can get up on? Because what we've seen happen here is that the deer will actually get over a piece of fence that's, say, 5.5 feet instead of 6 feet. They get over the fence, they get into the field, they're eating, they're enjoying themselves, and then they realize, holy moly, I don't know how to get out of here. They either don't remember where they came in, or they don't have the ability to back over in the same way. Maybe the hill that's on the other side of the fence isn't inside the fence. So now you have a deer panicking, and he's in your field, and he's running around, and he's pooping everywhere, and he's stepping on everything and stopping to snack along the way. And so that's why it's really important to look at the fences and look at every inch to make sure that it really is as high as it needs to be. And then if you have other critters, so for example, you want to keep rabbits out, you don't need a 6-foot fence for rabbits. So if there's no deer around and you want to do a 6-foot rabbit fence, that's great. But you need to think about the size of the gauge of wire and the size of the little squares on your fencing. So I say this because I have put up a fence before, and the little squares were were they a quarter inch? They were a ½ inch. So they were ½ inch squares. And what I didn't realize is that little lizards and snakes would try to go through this fence, and they would get stuck. And so it really became a buffet for the birds. So big mistake on my part. I ended up attracting birds to the area because I basically fed them their meal right there on the fence. So ½ inch doesn't work well. I would not suggest trying that. Quarter inch, though, does work well because those critters can't get in there. So I like the quarter inch and then the bigger squares as well when you're doing deer fencing or things like that. So again, it depends what kind of animal you're trying to keep out. You also have to think about whether your fence needs to be dug underground or not. So that's really important if you have diggers, if you've got coyotes or foxes or anything that wants to dig under, not to mention domestic animals. You might have tortoises in some areas, and the tortoises might want to dig under because they would also love some delicious leafy greens. So you have to watch out for your diggers. And if that's the case, you need to get your fence at least 12 to 18 inches into the ground. And ideally, it's going to have an L shape at the bottom of it facing out away from the field so that when the diggers start digging in from the outside, they're just going to hit fencing down under the ground and right below them, directly below them in that L shape. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration when you're thinking about which animal you're keeping out. So,
I'm just going to give you feedback that the vision of those lizards hanging on the fence and being chewed on by the birds is a fantastic vision. That's worth the price of admission.
well, thank you.
Everybody else is muted, so they couldn't give you the positive feedback. I just wanted to appreciate that for a minute.
Oh, thank you. It was a little horrifying for me personally. I'm a bit of a bunny hugger, but the birds did need to eat, so I understand. Farmer wasn't that happy. So yeah, so hopefully that vision of the lizards and the snakes stuck in ½ inch fencing will make you remember to do the quarter inch or larger. So let's talk about noise deterrence. So you guys have probably all seen farmers try to use things like sound cannons and screamers. So I know here the sound cannons go off, the birds take off, and they wait a good, 30 seconds to 3 minutes, and they go right back to the field. So it's really important that they put these sound cannons and screamers and things like that on some sort of randomized timer, because if the birds know it's coming, they look at their watches, but they're out of there right before it goes off. So it has to be random, but then even when it is random, they get used to it. They know it's a terrible noise, but they also know that they're not going to be hurt. So they know they can come back and eat. So again, it's another thing that we can use in our arsenal of deterrence. It's just not going to work on its own. Now, one of the things people have tried recently, someone had told me that they tried injured bird calls, which sounds spectacular because then all of his friends are going to go, oh, Tommy Bird's hurt. We better not go over there. But you know who shows up, of course? The coyotes. So in deterring your nuisance birds, you've now attracted these larger mammals. So you have to be careful about using injured animal calls because you are undoubtedly going to attract a predator into your field. So it's not the animal you were trying to deter because you did it, but there will be others in its place. And so be careful of the consequences of using some of these, the unexpected consequences. So visual deterrence is another. And I love the floppy guys. Like, this is one of my favorites. And I know decoys kind of falls under this visual deterrence. So the floppy guy there on the right, I'm fascinated with the floppy guys because there's been a lot of research that shows that it works well in places like orchards, but no one has done it in leafy green fields. And I actually did apply to put these floppy guys in leafy green fields, and I can't believe it, but nobody has given me the funding. I'm shocked. But I can just see 200,000 acres of floppy guys here in Yuma. They're supposed to do a great job because of their unrepeatable dancing motion. So the birds don't know what to expect. So they do really well at keeping them out. The only issue is that you need one floppy guy per acre and a half. So that's a lot of floppy guys. And then you need a generator and the air blower and all that other stuff. But if you do have a smaller piece of land, I think it would be spectacular to have the floppy guys out there. So we have a farmer that just purchased 12 of these floppy guys, and he is putting them out in his leafy green fields now. So I can't wait to see if it works for leafy greens, because it's going to be spectacular someday having these guys all over Yuma. But of course, we use other things as well. So we use lasers. Some of our farmers have used lasers very successfully. And in fact, the falconer that I work with uses lasers simultaneously while she's flying her birds. If there are birds nearby in trees or perching somewhere, she just shines her green laser right up at them very quickly, and they're out of there. They leave. The problem, of course, is that this is really heavy-duty hours for people. So it's a lot of people time to have someone stand there with lasers. You can't just have like a laser light show. It won't work out. So you have to be really targeted. Floppy guys are a little easier because you don't have to be out there. And then Mylar, of course, if you look at the floppy guy, he's got a bunch of Mylar on the end of his head and his hands. So it's just that shiny paper. And it works because of the visual that it gives the birds. So they're not sure what it is, and it's flashing light around, and so they will leave. But the problem is, how do you get that into your fields? So it's a little bit challenging when you have very large fields to just have Mylar strings hanging around all over the place. And so here in Yuma, they will surround a field with Mylar strings, so that all the fencing will have Mylar attached to it that will flap in the wind. And then they'll do the weirdo scarecrows, the white sheet scarecrows that scare me. And then they'll do some noise deterrents at the same time, some randomized noise deterrents. So they'll do a combination of all of these in hopes that it will be enough for the birds to want to go in a different direction. So then we have tactile repellents. And so there's a lot more animals than birds. We talk a lot about birds because the growers really have trouble keeping them out. But there are other animals that we need to keep out too. And so things like tactile repellents, animals like cats, so bobcats and things like that, they don't like sticky things on their pads. Most animals don't, canines either. So if you have something sticky surrounding, say there's a wall that they're able to get over, or a fence or something like that, if you put something sticky on it, they usually don't like that. But if what they're after is more delicious and more interesting than the sticky stuff, they're probably just going to go over it anyway. And speaking about the sticky stuff, so I have this issue with glue traps because here in Yuma, and I'm guessing this is the same everywhere, is that we have a zero tolerance for rodents in our fields. And so the growers put out traps, obviously, to keep the rodents out of the fields. And it's not so much that the rodents are a problem in terms of their poop and the pathogens. They're more a problem with getting stuck in bagged salad because they're really light and they sometimes don't get sifted out of the bagged salad. I know you're going to think about this later, but that's why they need to keep them out, because they're really light. And can make it through the process. They can make it through the system. And so what they'll do is they'll put out glue traps. They don't use any poisons while there's actual real produce that's being grown for human consumption in the field. They won't put out poison at that time. So instead, some of them use glue traps, some use snap traps, and I've made it my life's mission to try to get farmers to stop using glue traps. And I encourage you to do the same, because even though they're easy, there's a lot of wildlife that gets stuck in these glue traps that shouldn't be. So, there are things like lizards and snakes and things like that, but it's really just an inhumane way to be catching the animals because they don't die on the glue trap. Usually the rodents will try to eat their own legs off and they're screaming and it's bloody and it's not a pretty picture. So snap traps are the way to go because when snap traps work, they work great. So I always recommend that people use the snap traps. The reason the farmers don't want to do that is because the glue traps are quick and easy. You sit those down all around the outside of the field or in the PVC pipes where we put them, and you can just have a guy go once a week with a big trash bag and just throw them all out, hoping that the rodents are all dead. Whereas with the snap traps, you actually have to open it, you have to put the rodent in the trash bag, then you have to rebait and reset the trap. So it's a little bit more challenging, but they don't really learn it very well. And so that's why it keeps working. So just because a whole bunch of them got caught on a glue trap doesn't mean the rest of their friends are not going to get caught. They will all eventually, most of them will end up on the glue trap. So I would just recommend that you talk with your growers about using snap traps instead of glue traps just because it's inhumane. So next one is relocation. So this one seems like it should be relatively easy, right? You set a trap, you move the animal. But the question is, where are you going to move this animal? Are you going to move it to your neighbor's farm? Are you going to bring it home? What are you going to do with it? So this is, again, where you need to talk with your local Fish and Wildlife, Game and Fish, whoever your local agency is, because in most instances, it is not legal to relocate or translocate an animal out of your field to another location. And that's because there's risk of disease transmission. So if you are bringing an animal even half a mile away, if it has a small home range, they may have different pathogens in the animal that you're translocating than the ones where you're moving it to. And so it could cause a potential die-off in wild animals, disrupt the balance. Another thing is that things like rodents are actually very social critters. And so you might feel good about trapping them and moving them because you go, oh, look, I released them and they're going to be okay. Well, they're not. They're going to die because they need their friends and family. So unless you're trapping an entire family all together, they're going to die anyway. You just don't have to see it. So relocation is not really a great option for some animals. It's an excellent option for tortoises if you can find a good location for them. But you should definitely work with your local agencies to figure out which animals you can and cannot move and where they can go. Because again, tortoises also have issues with upper respiratory infection, herpes virus, things like that. So you can't just willy-nilly move them around. So always check with your agencies to see where they can go and if they can even be moved. So I mentioned earlier that I did a study here in Yuma, and it was related to a concentrated animal feeding operation and the wildlife that were going in and out of that location. And you can see behind the mouse there. So he's up on the hill at the CAFO, and you can see the leafy green fields are right there. So they're very nearby. And so when I was a postdoc for Michelle J. Russell, this is the project that she hired me to work on. So we trapped, I think it was 775 rodents and almost 400 birds. And we tested them for salmonella and shigatoxin-producing E. coli, and I found no E. coli or 157 in any of our birds or rodents, but I found 2 to 3% of all the birds and rodents that I caught did have either salmonella and or shigatoxin-producing E. coli. And so when you think about that and you go, well, 2 to 3% is kind of a low number. Well, not if you have 1,000 birds land in your field. Then that 2 to 3% sounds kind of high. So we have to be really careful that we do keep these animals out. It seems like it's not that big a deal. And I mentioned earlier that the rodents are kept out more because they're a problem in getting into bag salads, but this is still a risk. So there's still a risk of pathogens with them. And now if we talk about domesticated animals, let's see where our next slide is. Here. Okay, so with domesticated animals here in Yuma, we do have a lot of hobby farms that are around our leafy green fields. So people will have horses or pigs or sheep or things like that. And so before the growers plant, they actually will go and meet with the neighbors and see what they can do about these animals. Sometimes I've seen them just put up silt fence right around the animal enclosures in hopes that that will prevent anything. We don't really have a problem with runoff so much here, so it's really just blocking it from the wind, from airborne pathogens. But I do know a grower that had a woman move in, and she had 3 horses and moved in right next to the leafy green field. And so every growing season, the grower transports her horses to a boarding facility and pays for them to be boarded until the end of the growing season, and then brings her horses back. She agreed to let them do that. And sometimes you just have to do that. If that's what it is, you know, keep your neighbors happy and move their animals if they're willing. If not, you have to find another way to manage it before you plant. Because what happens is the buyers, the ones that are actually going to buy this produce, if they see that there's an animal nearby, they may tell you that they don't want your produce. And that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of produce you could lose out on because you've got domesticated animals nearby. And if it's as simple as putting your neighbor's horse in a boarding facility, then you might as well do it. Similarly, when they're thinking about where they're going to plant, they have to think about if there's an actual animal production area nearby, something like a concentrated animal feeding operation where they might be storing manure, they might be making compost, they might have thousands and thousands of animals there at the site. And here, the LGMA, the Leafy Green Marketing Agreement, states that they can't grow leafy greens for human consumption within 400 feet of one of these CAFOs. But again, with the buyers, they get the final say. And there's a lot of buyers that say that they will not purchase any produce within a mile of a CAFO or a mile of a compost operation. And so that's a pretty significant distance. And so what they've done here is they're now growing alfalfa nearby to the CAFO, or wheat, or something else that has to be processed instead of leafy greens. And so the farmers really need to think about that and think about who their buyer is before they put these leafy greens in the ground. And then, of course, they need to assess the wildlife risks, right? So they have to think about, you know, how many animals are coming and going? What's their movement like? How likely is it that they're going to contaminate the field? And so I always recommend that people just buy a couple of trail cameras. They're cheap, relatively inexpensive, and you can put up trail cameras, and then you can see if you think you've got deer coming in and out, you think you have wild pigs, just put up a trail camera and take a look and see. You might see some really unexpected things on these trail cameras. You might think you have deer because you see a hoof print, and then you come back and you realize it was a pig, which is a completely different way to keep them out of the field rather than deer. So grab a trail camera or two, put them around your fields, and just see who's out there. And it's fun to do this too. It actually is really fun to go check your cameras in the morning. And then the other thing you can do for things that you may not see, maybe you're not picking up on the rodents and you go, wow, we don't have any rodents here. You probably do. So you can do something as simple as buying some Sherman traps. And so you can see in that bottom picture there, those silver rectangular things, those are Sherman traps, and they're live traps. And you can just bait them with, I use oats and peanut butter, just a tiny, tiny little peanut butter just for the smell. And you mix it up with the oats, you put it in the back of the trap. I usually throw some cotton balls in there so they can have some bedding overnight. And you can just trap them and see what you get. You can either just count the rodents, or you can actually look and see what species you have, because that's interesting too. But it will give you a better idea of how many rodents you have. And then, of course, if you work with your local agency and you want those rodents disposed of instead of released, they can work with you on humanely euthanizing them and not putting them back out into your field. And then you can do this periodically and see how many rodents you're catching. Same thing with bird counts. You can go out and there are techniques to count birds. And so, for example, you'll walk a transect through your field, you stop, and for 5 minutes, you count the number of birds flying overhead versus the number landing in the field. And when I do that, I have a clicker in each hand. So one clicker is for the overhead birds and one is for the ones that have landed. And that way it just gives you an idea, you know, how many birds are visiting us. And if you do it throughout the day, you find out when the peak times are, and you go, okay, so between 10 and noon, I seem to have a lot more birds than between noon and 4. So maybe you want to have somebody standing out there scaring birds just from 10 to noon. That might be more cost effective than another method. So these are just the ways that you can assess what your situation is and how to address it. And then we've got working animals and pets. So pets, of course, should be excluded from produce fields. You don't want your dogs and your cats hanging out inside your produce and your fresh leafy greens. And I will admit that is my dog on the right, Halaku, sitting next to a leafy green field because we're surrounded by fields here. And he's showing you what not to do. Even though he's sitting next to the field, we always tell people not to allow their pets to even be on those dirt roads around the fields. However, the dog on the left is not my dog. That is my husband in the background, and I'm in the front, and we are trying to catch this dog because he is running like a fiend through the leafy green fields. And we chased this dog for hours and hours to try to catch him. And because of that, this is something that happens a lot here in Yuma, and I don't know how often it happens where all of you are, but a male dog can smell a female dog in heat up to 5 miles away. And they don't ever take the roads to get to those girls. They will just make a beeline straight through the field to get to them. And so here in Yuma, we have a campaign with the Humane Society called Pets and Produce Don't Mix. And the farmers contribute to this campaign, and it is to provide low-cost spay-neuter to anyone in the county who lives near produce fields, and they can bring their animals in and get low-cost spay-neuter, so that way their dogs and their cats will get fixed, and hopefully they'll get some education about keeping them, confined on their property and things like that. But that's what we do here to make sure that these animals are not out and about, and it is a significant problem here, and that's why they came up with the campaign, and they're still working on it. They do it every year. So, of course, tell visitors to leave their pets at home, and petting zoos, hobby farms, things like that. So hobby farms have to be, according to LGMA, have to be at least 30 feet away from leafy greens, and in most cases, they're much more than that. So now we get to pre-harvest assessment. So let's say you've done everything you're supposed to do. You did your assessment before you planted. You wanted to make sure there weren't that many animals around. You want to make sure that everything, all your fences are up, you've got your sound cannons, you have your crazy scarecrows, you've done everything, right? So now you've grown your crops, everything looks great, and you're going to do your pre-harvest assessment. And so what you're going to do is you're going to walk your field and you're going to look for fecal contamination. You're going to look for any plants that have been kind of munched on by any animals. And you've done this. The farmers do this throughout the whole season, but pre-harvest is the most critical time to do it. And here in Yuma, pre-harvest is considered anywhere from 3 to 7 days before the harvest date. And so they do all of the testing, the pathogen testing, and checking for contamination at that point. But just because you didn't find anything 3 to 7 days before harvest doesn't mean that this isn't going to happen. So these are red-winged blackbirds. And I had some farmers call me, the farmer who owns this field called me one morning and he said, we were ready to harvest and we're having a little bird problem. Can you go out and look? And this is what I came to. So he had already done all his due diligence. He had done everything he was supposed to do, paid for the water, weeded the fields, did all his pre-harvest assessments, spent thousands and thousands of dollars on pathogen testing. But that was 3 days ago. And now the red-winged blackbirds have decided that romaine looks delicious. And so they have just flooded the field. And in one morning, literally a couple of hours, there was not a single plant that was untouched, and they lost 12 acres that morning. And so they need to know, the farmers need to know that they need to be on top of the wildlife issue all the time. It's not just, hey, we did our pre-harvest assessment, there was no poop, everything came back clean from the pathogen testing, we're great, we're moving ahead. Well, they're not moving ahead because now they just lost a ton of produce and a ton of money from these birds. And they had another field right next door to it that the birds were not yet touching, but they kind of looked like they were headed that way. And that was not ready for harvest yet. And so I called the farmer back and said, you better get somebody out here with vehicles and horns blowing and things like that. And they did. They spent the rest of the morning literally driving the fields, blowing the horn, gunfire, whatever they could do to keep the birds away. And it was quite an amazing sight to see these animals. And this is a a field that had been in production for over 10 years. They had never, ever had a bird problem ever before. Those solar panels that you can see in the background, the birds were just sitting all up on that mountain when I got there. They were all on the hill around the solar panels, and those panels have been there for many years. We've never seen birds hanging out up there. So we don't know what happened. We don't know what was different, why the birds wanted to be there. You never know. They don't give you a reason. So they will just show up whenever they want to. And it appears that the critical time for some species of birds, there's two critical times. There's the sprouting, because it's this delicious little sweet green thing coming out of the ground, and that's when horned larks come, at least here in Yuma. And then right before harvest, literally a day or two before harvest, the red-winged blackbirds come in. And of course, there's other species of birds that come as well, but those are our two really critical time points. So like post-germination and pre-harvest. And so you don't want this to happen. So they have to be very diligent with checking for birds. And of course, the corrective actions, you have to decide what you're going to harvest. Obviously, nothing that's contaminated. Here, the LGMA says that we can't harvest anything within 5 feet of a piece of poop. Now, you saw all those birds that came in. So generally, you're not going to have a piece of poop. You're going to have a lot of poop. And you have to go 5 feet out from that last piece of poop in your field. But again, we go back to the buyers. And so the buyers, many of them have said, that's not far enough. We want 50 feet, or we're not taking anything within 100 feet of a piece of poop, which is crazy in my mind as the food safety and wildlife extension specialist, but they don't want to risk their name. And so it's understandable to some degree, right? Because what if? There's always the what if. What if we would have just done 50 feet instead of 5 feet? And then nobody would have gotten sick. And so you have to understand why they're doing it. So there is a lot of produce left behind. So when you see fields that have a lot of produce left in them in squares, generally it's because there was some type of buffer that had to happen because of feces or pathogen testing. Let's see. So that's the rest of our corrective actions. And of course, document, document, document. That's a big one. I tell them all the time to document everything they can. And with the workers, so the workers are really critical to the farmers. They need to be trained to look for tracks and scat and anything else that might indicate that there is an issue. And the workers should report that right away. And in fact, at this field, you can see the hoof prints, and you also see paw prints in the bottom corner. So what happened was the workers stopped the harvest. They were actually harvesting this field, and everything had come back negative for pathogens. They found no fecal material. While they were harvesting, the workers saw tracks, and they stopped the harvest immediately, and they called me, and I went out there, and while I was on my way, they actually found urine. They found deer urine. The worker came over to me and asked me if I wanted to come see it. And I said, of course I do. So I went out and he showed me, he picked up the dirt in his hands and he told me, smell this. And I was like, holy moly, how did you even do that? So they knew what to look for. They looked for the tracks. They then found the urine. And the more we walked through, then we were able to find feces, but the feces wasn't on the ground. It was inside the romaine heads. They happened to poop in just the right spot, so it ended up in the plant, not on the ground. And so these guys knew what they were doing. They knew what they were looking for. And in addition to that, as we were walking around, we found coyote tracks behind the deer tracks. So it was really interesting. And at that point, of course, we had to figure out where did they get in, because this was a fenced field. So we had to figure out where did they get in, how did they get out? And, of course, the grower did lose a significant amount of that crop as well, because even though there wasn't necessarily feces everywhere, there was the risk involved because there were tracks everywhere. So, and that was thanks to the workers. And so the workers are really and such a critically important asset for these farmers, especially at harvest time. So again, we go back to record keeping, of course, the musts and the shoulds, and our summary. And I think that's it for me.
I love that your response to, do you want to see this pile of urine? The answer was, of course I want to see the urine.
Of course. I want to see the urine. I want to see the poop. I want to see the tracks. Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of fun, actually, because, you start this investigation and you want to figure out where the animal came from, where it went to, what it was doing. Was there a mama and a baby deer and they were being tracked by a coyote? You get this whole story going. But it's really important for the growers because it really can lead to important decisions about how do we prevent this from happening next time? Because now we lost 8 acres, and that is pretty crummy. So how do we make that not happen?
We have probably just a couple of minutes for questions. I suppose there are two ways we can do this. You can either put your question into the chat box, or you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So let's give it just a second while I get to that spot. There we go. Yes.
While you get to there, I can jump on in and summarize kind of what's been going on in the chat box while Paula was presenting her talk. There are a couple of people that inquired about copies of the Southwest Scat guide that Paula was talking about, and I just want to remind everybody that we will wrap up. We've been taking notes today, and we will send out notes along with some of these recommendations for different Scat guides that are kind of nationwide or regional. And on that topic as well, Judy Harrison mentioned that she sent us an Amazon link, and I will include that in the link in the notes that go out to everybody, but there is a Southeast wildlife species scats and traps guide that she recommended. And additionally, Becky just kind of had a comment on tactile repellents. If you remember back in the deterring wildlife section, Paula was talking a little bit about tactile repellents and didn't really recommend them. And Becky mentioned that according to the Cornell University Lab of Ornithology, and she actually included a link that I will include in the notes, tactile repellents are not recommended by that lab because of issues with different bird plumage. Additionally, the dust sticks to it and limits its effectiveness.
And then I have one other update that thank you, Kate Allen, for telling us that although Floppy Guy is an excellent, is a great description of those tube dancers, if you want to find it on the internet, you're going to want to look for a, oh, and I just lost it, air dancer.
An air ranger.
Oh, what was the other word for it?
They're called air rangers.
Air ranger? Okay, she said air dancer, so other options to look for it under.
And it looks like there are a couple of questions. So I think we have time for a couple of questions from the chat box. The first one is asking which animals are the most hazardous? And I'm sure this is kind of a loaded question or a very generalized question.
It is a very loaded question. It depends where you are, of course. And in terms of hazardous, do you mean most hazardous in terms of the amount of pathogens that they carry? Because we have found foodborne pathogens in lots of different critters, everything from rodents and birds to coyotes, javelina, feral pigs. You know, they're all carrying something to some degree. And so that's why just generally poop is considered hazardous, because there's always the potential for those foodborne pathogens to be in there.
Thank you, Paula. And additionally, from Luisa Castro, we have the question, why are we only being told to look for poop in the field and not animal urine? Does urine also carry pathogens? I would assume so.
That is a great question. So urine, of course, is supposed to be sterile, but the minute it leaves your body, it is no longer sterile. So yeah, there's probably some things in there. I don't know of studies that have looked at foodborne pathogens in urine, but the urine is a good indicator of just, has an animal been here? So just kind of assessing if anyone has been there. And it's really hard to see urine. And so it really was those workers' ability to smell it. So if I in particular have a very sensitive nose, and I can smell urine, you know, or other terrible things that you don't really want to smell way too far away. I'm super sensitive to it. And if you have a sensitive nose, you might be really good at finding animal urine. And so just kind of, I would suggest as you're walking around looking at tracks, to look for wet spots and sniff around and try to find out what the different urines smell like. They're not good. So if you smell anything that's a little off, a little sour, you probably are smelling some sort of urine. And so, but it's hard to look for it. That's the thing, because you don't know if it's wet from urine or if it's wet from something else. But certainly you should be looking for anything that would indicate the presence of an animal. So while you're looking for tracks, now you'll be curious. You'll find all those wet spots and just scoop it up with gloves on. And take a little whiff and see what it is.
Donna, do you want to feed us one more question, and then we'll get to the PSA update? Betsy, feel free to disagree.
No, that's fine. We have time for a few more questions if there are one. I saw one in the chat box from Annalisa talking about recommendation for baited traps in or near the field, as we typically don't recommend baited traps near a packing house because we don't want to draw them in. So I think she was asking for clarification for that.
That is always a worry about drawing animals in, but I think it's part of the overall recommendation in order to control the populations, at least out in the field. You don't want to draw them to the field, but if you can draw them to the bait and continuously trap them there, that will prevent them from being in the field. And so the idea of drawing them in isn't great, but otherwise they're just going to be running around and you're not going to be killing them. So if you can't use poison, your next best bet is just going to be to bait them and trap them. And my husband says all the time that because I put up fly traps at our house, and he goes, "You're attracting every fly in Yuma." Well, eventually I will catch them all. That's my thought. So I think keep baiting, keep trapping, and keep doing it and being really on top of it. You have to have really a program in place. You need to have it very structured and know how much bait you're putting out and how many animals you're catching, and look for trends, when you have peaks and when there might not be anybody in your trap. And so if you can get on this structured kind of program, you will potentially be bringing in some that wouldn't have gotten there anyway, but the point is you want to get rid of them. And so I think that's why we're doing it out in the field.
So it falls into the category of nothing's perfect and you think this is better than nothing.
Yes, exactly. Better than letting them just run around.
Yeah. B. Hansen also added that lots of diseases, including zoonotic diseases, can be transmitted between humans and animals passed through urine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are lots of diseases that you can get. And I actually meant to talk about that when I was talking about relocating animals, because that is definitely a concern. There's lots of critters that you don't necessarily want to be able to grab you. So things like I accidentally trapped an armadillo once and only found out later that they potentially carry leprosy, which of course I didn't get. I waited 10 years to make sure. But, there's definitely some things you can get. There's, rat bite fever that most people don't even know about, that you can get from a bite or a scratch from a rodent. Of course, they have to be infected with the bacteria, but yeah, you're right. There's lots of things that you can get. And yeah, urine, like I said, is definitely not sterile once it's out in the world. So
I also would add, though, that this isn't about I think the point of the discussion of urine is to talk about it's one of the things you can look for to help you. I think the original question was, within the rule, it doesn't talk about urine. It does talk about fecal material. And so I think the whole discussion is just one more thing that you can use as an indicator that they're there. I think the other point you made was that the workers were so well trained that they knew to pay attention to these things. And I think that's the other piece that is worth saying again. So even if it's not required in the rule, the issue is how can it be used to further your food safety program?
And
exactly.
just as a side note, they do take pains in some parts of the rule to talk about excreta instead of feces, so that might cover the urine aspect of it.
Right. Okay. With that, I would really like to thank Paula for putting together the talk and for your time today. That was fabulous, and thanks to everyone for the questions. I'd like to transition now to the last couple of slides just to give you an update of PSA things that are going on. As you know, there are summits coming up. We have another soil summit, which is going to be January 21st to the 22nd. This very likely could be our last soil summit. I won't say it will be, but it right now is the last soil summit plan. There were still seats last time I looked in that. If you're interested in going, that'll be the third one. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. We are organizing a national water summit. The in-person attendance is going to be capped at 100, but we plan to make remote options, including, for you educators on the call, including having a facilitated group real time that goes to the topics and then feeding that information into the meeting. So if you're an educator and you want to get 10, 15 people together to have a discussion, facilitate it like we're doing in Kentucky, and then feed that information in, we are hoping to make that a possibility. And we hope to get registration open in the next 10 days, if possible. We are still working on FDA to work out some funding and some other details, including approval of the agenda. We've been working with NASDA on that as well. Lastly, I guess not lastly, I do want to update you on some PSA materials that we just finished at the end of the year. We have version 1.1, which is available now. If you have a huge bin of 1.0s, don't panic. You can still use them. We just corrected some typos, clarification of a little bit of some PSR requirements, section symbols, added some resources. But again, your 1.0s are fine. There is a change log, so you can see that if you have 1.0 and you're curious what changed. You can download it and you can see the bookstore link right there if you need to order them. I guess this is where I say lastly. This next slide gets at teaching materials. We released a couple of new optional activities and PowerPoints that you could use as supplemental materials in a training. As you know, when we launched it, a lot of folks were unhappy that we didn't have too many hands-on activities. We have definitely tried to respond to that, to put in things that you can use during the training to kind of keep people engaged. Name the zone activity, which is PowerPoint with some printable photos that you can use. Is this agricultural water? This is one of my favorites. It's great to put at the very beginning of Module 5, get people thinking about what it says in the rule. Is this really ag water? Why or why not? And we also put some supplemental slides together for the agricultural water, some of the information, the extension of the compliance dates and all of that. So those are available to you under trainer resources on the PSA website. Next meeting is tentatively scheduled for February 5th. I know we've been talking to USDA. They want to do an educators call because they're changing the harmonized audit, and they want to share some of the information about that. So I'm not sure that'll be in February or later, but we are planning to have a call. We will send out the meeting invite via the educators listserv closer to the time. If you are interested in hearing about a topic, please let us know, because it's great to respond to requests with folks like Paula who have the opportunity to join us and share information with us to improve how we offer information to our stakeholders. So that's that. And as always, our website is a great place. I will throw all of my extension colleagues in the PSA team under the bus by saying that there's cute little videos that went up recently. So if you're wondering what your regional extension associate sounds like or looks like, you can now click on that video and listen to them tell you why they like doing what they're doing and what they think is important for growers to know. So as always, I appreciate you guys taking your time to be with us. Again, shout out to Paula. I do want to make a special recognition of Don Steckel and Donna today. Gretchen is a little under the weather right now, so they stepped up and really made sure that everything worked today. So I really appreciate that. And with that, I will thank you all. It's being recorded, so we'll hopefully have this up online shortly. And I wish all of you a very happy and healthy 2018. And there's lots of good work yet to do.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.